Kum Lenin Ablak Gemara. This is Wednesday's Daf Ches Amid Aleph. We're going to see the Gemara today, as usual. And the Gemara, you can that you have to go through the whole shas if you want to get a picture, an overview of a certain Indian. Otherwise, you get only half project. So here we're going to have a Gemara that you put this Gemara together with Gemara Erevin, you get a full picture. Exactly. Patient says that in Christmas. And then you also have another sugya here, which you would never imagine it's here, and yet it's right here. The mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, which we would have thought it's in the end of Ksubas, talks about the wonderful things at Yisrael, right in the middle of Gittin. You would think Gittin, Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, where does it come in here? You will see unbelievable halacha and unbelievable controversy. Okay. No, but there are some politicians who have interesting names. Yeah, look it up, Rabbeinu Peter, which we learned yesterday. He spoke to Rabbeinu Tam, so obviously he was a Talmud of Rabbeinu Tam. Okay, we're up to the Gemara here, the two dots. Says the Gemara, the Mishnah says, it says, Aku is like Eretz Yisrael. That Aku is like Eretz Yisrael, at least for Gittin. At least for Gittin. If somebody sells, that we learn in the Gemara that if you're selling if you sell your slave to Chutz La'aretz, you have to set him free because you're denying him the opportunity to do all these mitzvahs. What about Surya? Surya is like we're serious today, and the story of Surya is that David HaMelech conquered Surya to expand the borders of Eretz Yisrael. So there's a thing called Kibush Rabim, there's a thing called Kibush Yachid. This is considered a private endeavor of David HaMelech, private ambition of David HaMelech, and there's an argument if a kibush yachid shmei kibush or lo shmei kibush doesn't have the status of a kibush, which means whatever countries, territorial claims that Yisrael has that it expands is considered now part of Eretz Yisrael with all the dinim of Eretz Yisrael, or no. So Surya is one of those, and I'm saying that which David HaMelech conquered. Why? What's the definition of kibush yachid? We'll see in a minute. So after you sold a slave from Eretz Yisrael to Surya, is that considered selling it chutz la'aretz, and therefore, or sort of a step lower? We're up to Chesam and Aleph, about 8 lines on the bottom. So if you sold a slave not to chutz to the aspera, you have to send free, but to Surya, is that equal to Eretz Yisrael, and therefore it doesn't go free, or not? Is he kemeicha b'chutz la'aretz, like selling it to the aspera? I like. He said to the Surya, Limtna Mishnah, Meir, Oimer, Aku, Kedr, Yisrael, Gittin. Seems like Gittin in la avodim loy. Only, what does he stress that for Gittin is considered part of it as a result? As if to say, but for slaves, if you sell your slave to Aku, it's as if you sold him to the diaspora and you go free. So if Aku, which is Mamish abutting Eretz Yisrael, is considered chutz la'aretz for slaves, surely Surya, which is only a personal conquest of David HaMelech, is much further. So now that we mentioned Surya, it says the Gemara, tell them what we learned. In 3 ways, Surya is compared to Yisrael. In 3 ways, it's 3 like Chutz La'aretz. Siman of Barek. Afara Tamei. We learned before that the sand of Chutz La'aretz is Tamei. And we had whole sugya nazir, whether just the gush, just the sand, or the avir as well, the air because you're hovering, it's like oil, you're hovering over the sand. Why did they decree that all the sand of Chutz La'aretz is tamid? Because they never marked their graves properly, and especially if it's a fetus or something, and if a kohen steps over there, he might be stepping on top of a grave, or the size of an etzim kisayda, a bone the size of a barley ready to be tamid if you touch it or you move it, and it could be they'll move it, so it'll be banned. All that we said, if you go to Chutz La'aretz, this is what happens. Because so always, remember, you had a few Gemaras already, and Shkol and others, they used to go and mark off all the graves. Rabbi Noah, he killed somebody. That's the first thing he did. He said the first. Oh. Second time. He was impressed with the flowers.
He found the field, but I didn't know when it's okay.
Exactly.
Okay.
That's true.
So he had to go with the market.
That's a base of pras. We call that a base of pras. But generally speaking, that's all they're very careful. So Afara Tomik, that Surya is treated like Chutz La'aretz when it comes to the offer. The Rabbanon will gaze there as well. The same thing is if you sell your servant, your slave in Surya, it's as if you sold Chutz La'aretz, you have to set him free. But maybe get Surya, if you bring a get Surya because it's so distant, it's maybe Chutz La'aretz because the agent didn't travel to and fro, and therefore you needed to say before a nechter or nechter. Those are the 3 cases we compare Surya to Chutz La'aretz. Over Shloisha all that 3 cases we to throw. Number 1, Chayev the Meiser Shmita Yisrael. Chayev the Meiser Shmita just like Eretz Yisrael. Number one. Number two. There is a way of entering there betara if you're inside a box with the lid open, as opposed to Eretz Amim. Even if you do that, it's also. Remember, you had an opinion that the Avir, we had an argument, what about the airspace of Eretz Amim? So if you go in a box and the lid is uncovered, you're still in the airspace. And Rebbe says airspace is tummy. So Isuria, the airspace is not. The ground is tummy, the sand itself, but not the airspace. If you're inside a box and you're transported or in a carriage, you're all right. Mashain came, the rest of Chutzlar you're not. And hakoine sada beSuria, if you purchase property in Syria, is koine bepravare Yerushalayim, as if you bought in the suburbs of Yerushalayim. What does that mean? We'll soon see. Let's go through now. Chayev the Meiser Shvit somebody holds kibush yachish make kibush. A kibush of a yachid is called a kibush. Now Rashi gives us two things what makes it a kibush yachid. Now, first of all, you didn't have 600,000 Jews that united behind it. It's not like when by Yeshua, the conquest of Yeshua, everybody entered Israel together to conquer Israel. Number one, and number two, and this is a little bit hard to understand. There we conquered it for Klal Yisrael, and here Dormel did it for himself. But what do you mean personal? A king, whatever king is, it's not personal to the land. It belongs to. So what do you mean exactly personal? What does it mean when he said he did it lit atzma? Is it for his maybe aggrandizement? Is that what he means l'tzor chay? But at the end of the day, it doesn't belong to him. It belongs to Halak Yisrael. I'm not sure what actually means l'tzor chay. Anyway, Taisus has another parallel together. Taisus is that David and Melech, anything they conquered before they conquered the entire Yisrael is called kibush yachid. Because Yerushalayim at that stage was not yet, the Yevusi still lived in Yerushalayim. They didn't yet conquer the entire Yerushalayim. Therefore, it's considered kibush yachid. Okay. And this opinion holds that kibush yachid still has a status like Eretz Yisrael. Number one. Number two. What do you mean? You just said that the sand of Syria is tummy like the rest of Eretz Amim. What do you mean if you enter the Tara you can? If you go into a carriage or into a box or a closet, the Tanya we learned. And this is a question of airspace now. If you enter anywhere in Chutz La'aretz, b'sheida teve migdal, Rebbe says you tummy. Why? Because of two things. First of all, oil zaruk loishma oil, a mobile order is an accident order. So therefore, you're as if you have that oil and you're in the airspace. So airspace, now airspace itself, there's two ways of understanding. Is it because the airspace is tummy as well, or is it because now you're in oil, you're hovering over maybe a dead body on the ground? Okay, and if it's goyim, generally there's no oil by goyim, so then it's just the airspace. And so you're saying if I feel it goes in Eretz Amim in Chutz La'aretz, they said not only the ground is tummy but also the airspace. But they made a distinction between Surya and the rest. That Surya they were gozer on Gusha but not on the Avir. You remember in Avodah Zarah we had a whole discussion. You're not allowed to sell land to a goy like Chanim. Does that apply to Surya as well? If like Chanim, you're not allowed to sell land to a goy because it only applies to Israel. Because kibush yachid. For the Tzar Chai, there was no 600,000 people, or we didn't yet conquer Yerushalayim. And the whole question is also, but if the oil bubble, remember we learned before in Taisus that the oil bubble, the main thing, the oil bubble came in and took over, then that's all that matters. What's the difference? What happened to David Melech that kibush yachid into kibush yachid? So shot like this. When does oil bubble work? If the Rambam makes a distinction, Rebbe explains the Sichel Rogachover between how it was the first time was a Kinyan Chazaka, the second time was Muhammad and Chazaka, Kedusha. When was Ezra's kibush valid? Just the way they walked in, there was no war or anything else. Is if there was a first kibush edition in times of Yeshua, they did a proper kibush, then they lost it because they left, and then they did a second time, it was much easier. But if the first time was only merely a kibush yachid, if the first time you didn't do it properly through a Muhammad, which is a Kinyan Chazaka, and therefore then when Ezra came the second time, you weren't kibush either. Therefore, it's important. Surya, since Surya is a kibush yachid, even though let's say the times of Ezra that came and they settled there again, it did not become the kodesh like Eretz Yisrael. Okay. Third one is Vakoine. Surya Surya only did on the sand, but not on the Abir. Hakoine started Besuri Koine Bafar Yishlaim. As if you bought a sub Yishlaim. What does that mean? What's the relevance of that? I'm going to tell you. Shekoisvin olav oinoi afilu b'Shabbos. You write on it a star, even on Shabbos, a contract of sale. If you can buy a property there, good, go for it. Says more b'Shabbos al kedatach in Shabbos as well. Whereas the Kedamar Agrava says, not that you yourself write the shtar. You have a guy doing it for you. Even though instructing a guy to do a malach min Shabbos is a shvus asur rabbanim, here they suspended. Because in the midst of Yeshiva Yisrael, they weren't guys, and that includes Surya. First, you have to ask yourself, and Rashi says an interesting thing. What do you mean Yeshiva Yisrael? Is the midst of Yeshiva Yisrael to Rashi? I'll read you the Rashi because it's a very interesting Rashi. Rashi says mitzvah Yeshiva Yisrael legaresh oivei kachavim is a mitzvah to send away the guy. Well, the Yashi saw, but he just take over. What's the relevance of legaresh oivei kachavim? It's a mitzvah Yeshiva Yisrael for me to dwell at Yisrael. What does Rashi want? Okay, so I think Rashi is bothered with a very interesting question, which I haven't seen anybody ask. The Gemara wants to know the Mai Hilchasa when you say Surya, it's like you buy a house in Yerushalayim, that you have a kind of mitzvah Yeshiva Yisrael. That's all. What do you have to talk a mice about telling a guy to buy a house? Just say the mitzvah of Yeshiva Yisrael. The big argument that Ramban and the Rambam is there a mitzvah of Yeshiva Yisrael not? So the Ramban says there's a mitzvah of Yeshiva Yisrael, Rashneba, or others have other psukim they learn. He learns from Masay, other than from Dvarim. But the Rambam said there is no mitzvah, and the Megillah says the whole aricha that there's no mitzvah from the Torah, there's only the mitzvah of the Rabbanon. Others want to learn even no mitzvah either, only Bisman Beis Mikdash. The Yehud wants to learn that even Ma'atei there is. He has another pshat, or Rabbi Nezer, one of those I can't remember, has another pshat in the Rambam. The proof that there is no mitzvah is the same proof that the Tashbats brings that there is a mitzvah, which is the Gemara Seita at the end of the first page. The Gemara Seita says, why did Moshe Rabbeinu want to go to Israel? Did he want to go to Israel in order to eat fruit, the beautiful fruits? Moshe says, no, he wanted to do the mitzvah. What's the most question? He wanted to go because the mitzvah Yeshiva Yisrael. What do you have to add more mitzvahs? What about that very mitzvah? So that's the raya they bring that there's no mitzvah Yeshiva Yisrael. The Tashbat brings that Gemara as a raya that there is a mitzvah because you could do more mitzvahs, which sounds like the Tashbat really is saying the mitzvah Yeshiva Yisrael is not really a mitzvah. It's because it allows you to do other mitzvahs, and that's why there's an inyan of living at Yisrael, which is very different than what the Ramban says that there's a mitzvah in isolation called the mitzvah Yeshiva Yisrael. It seems that Rashi is bothered by this very question. The fact that the Gemara doesn't say that in itself is a mitzvah Yeshiva Yisrael, so Rashi says clearly there's no mitzvah Yeshiva Yisrael. So what's the Gemara saying then that you're allowed to write on Shabbos? So Rashi said there's another aspect. Make sure the goyim leave, and therefore he said the mitzvah is legadish lechavim. So in other words, if you hold the mitzvah Yeshiva Yisrael, if you're already living at Yisrael, what's the mitzvah now? If you're already living at Yisrael and I buy another house, am I allowed to write a star? I already did my mitzvah Yeshiva Yisrael. I'm there. I can't do twice the same mitzvah. But if you learn that the mitzvah is to chase away the guy, then even I'm living at Yisrael, I'm chasing away the guy. Fascinating discussion between the Tashbats of Shimon ben Sabach, the Rivash, who was his friend. They're both from Mallorca, then Algiers, and then his son Rajbash. The Rivash, yes. Rivash is from the last Bali Tastes, the Shalosh of the Rivash, brought down Shlomo all the time. The Tashbats, I don't know if they had it really well. A friend, he's actually older than the Rivash. A lot of arguments, a lot of fights, a lot of arguments. They're discussing, very interesting, what's a bigger mitzvah? To buy a house in Yisrael, or to live in Yisrael, or to be in Yisrael? So the day, if Tashbats want to say that Aliyah to Yisrael is not a mitzvah. Aliyah is not a mitzvah because it's, what's the mitzvah to go to Yisrael? The mitzvah is to be in Yisrael. So there's no such thing mitzvah called Aliyah to Yisrael. It's a machshire mitzvah. It's a machshire mitzvah. Yeah. So therefore, so there's a discussion. What's a bigger mitzvah? To buy a property in Yisrael, or to go to Yisrael? And the Rivash says buying a property is a much bigger mitzvah than to be in Yisrael because it's loyal and void, and others benefit from it as well. He says when you make an aliyah, this is the Rivash. The only one who gets from it is you. You went to Yisrael, but when you buy a property, took it away from a guy, and made it a Yiddish house, it's loyal and void now in that Yiddish hands because you're not allowed to sell it back to a guy like Sechanim. It's Yiddish hands, so the world benefits. That's the mitzvah. The mitzvah is when you benefit everybody else. That's the Rivash. Tashbat says no. The mitzvah is when you personally go, that you went to Yisrael, you're there already. And because the Gemara makes no distinction if you're already in Eretz Yisrael, if you're not in Eretz Yisrael. And according to what happens if you're in Chutz La'aretz, I have no plans to move to Eretz Yisrael. I want to buy a property in Yerushalayim. I want to own a house, a flat. It seems from here, Rashi says the main thing is he says that the mitzvah is whether it's not that you went there, he chased away going. And according to Rashi, what happens if you're buying a house from a Yid? Is there a mitzvah Yishuv Eretz Yisrael? Who do you Megadish? You bought a house from another Jew, a Jewish developer. Is there a mitzvah that Yishuv Eretz Yisrael? All of these details are not worked out in Shulchan Aruch or anything else. So just very, very interesting. And it all revolves around this little piece of Gemara here about how far we take mitzvah Yisrael. But what we're doing here is, and now it goes to the next set of laws. So the big machlekes now. You're having a goy right. Now we normally say a concept. This is the concept of Yisrael. When you're allowed to tell a goy, you're not allowed to tell a goy. It's also the Rabban. What about in certain instances, for example, tzorich mitzvah, tzorich chayla, not somebody very sick, but somebody a little slightly sick. So we say it's called a middle. The whole issa of telling a guy, is Rabbanon. Can you instruct a guy to prepare something for a chayla, for a mitzvah? I want the guy to carry me a sefer, and there's no eruv, carry me a sefer, bring me to me to shul. I forgot my siddur, I forgot my talus. Go to my house and bring it to me. So there's a big machlekes based on this Gemara right here. What are we allowing you to do here? We're allowing the guy to do an Issa D'Oraisa, to write a contract. Why? It's a mitzvah. So we see here that when it comes to mitzvah, you're permitted. So it's not a double shvus. It's only a single shvus. One Issa D'Rabbanan and one Issa D'Oraisa. But it's a mitzvah you can, and that's how the Bahag paskins. Everyone else everyone else says no. That this is Yishuv Yisrael is an exception. It is such a big mitzvah that we allow the guy to do an Issa D'Oraisa. But everywhere else, we only allow a guy to do a shvus to shvus. A shvus to shvus means is I can tell a guy, turn on the heating on Shabbos for the shul, let's say, but you can't tell the guy to turn on the lights because that's the Issa D'Oraisa. You cannot have a guy do an Issa D'Oraisa, even though it's for a mitzvah, but only an Issa D'Rabbanan. And so there's a machlekes. The Bahag holds you can have a guy do Issa D'Oraisa. This is in Shulchan Aruch Reish Ayin Vav Shin Vav Shin Zayin Shin Lamed Aleph and so on. And Pesach. Now, we also have the Gemara in Erevin there, where the water spilled out for a child for a bris, and we say that if the mother needs the water, because it's after 7 days already, so if the mother says I need it because the day of the bris, then you can also warm up for the child. So there's a whole discussion there. So the Chayda we see from even though you're doing for the bris, it's a mitzvah in the Torah. So we see from here that in order to you couldn't do it for the child's sake, you have to do it for the mother's sake. That means that you cannot do an Issa D'Oraisa for tzorich mitzvah. But then the Gemara says you're allowed to bring a knife for the bris if you forgot to bring the bris. There's an argument: are we carrying it through Rishus Harabim or through a karmelis? So the Rif holds you're allowed to do by a bris milah nisa deraisa. That means so someone to say the Rif holds like the Bahag that you can do, or that you can have a guy turn the lights on for you need it for your meal on Shabbos or Tadaven. But others say no, that bris milah is different than all other mitzvahs. And why is that? Because bris milah you're allowed to do on Shabbos itself, and that itself is a malacha deraisa. You can do that. So since the very mitzvah you're doing is a malacha deraisa, you can have a guy doing this, to supplement it. But other mitzvahs you can't. So this whole machlekes revolves around this little piece of Gemara here. Now, why and what would you think that if you ask her, so can a guy turn the lights on you on Shabbos? Oh, that's the Gittin. That's how looking Gittin. It's amazing. So anyway, so you have two big subjects that come out of this little line in the Gemara here by the mitzvah Yishuv Eretz Yisrael and by middle Akram Shavuos. It's interesting how the Gemara works. Second Gemara first. Turn on my if the Eved brought his own get. Now, Eved also has to say before and next. We'll see like next mission that Eved is like a woman. You have to, because to get shichrur, you have to say before and next. So what happened? The Eved brought a get, because in the get is written Atzmach, the person there, the owner said, "You v'nechas and all my assets k'nilach." He broke them into two phrases. Atzmai konos, as far as he is concerned, okay. He said, that's it. I could get of a woman. We have to establish the veracity of this get. Of this, as far as the commercial side of it, You follow all the other rules. You have to you have to find two witnesses who recognize the signature. So we break it up into two because there's two separate statements. So now the Gemara's question is, what happened to be one statement? He says, all my assets belong to you. You're one of my assets. So he put together the evidence and all the assets. What happens then? It says, since he's kind himself, because he said before, and then the rest is sort of, is included automatically to himself, and then everything else comes along with it. It's a tag along, drag along. I disagree. I believe in a concept called Palgin the Buddha. We break up the word. If you ever look at the this is a very heavy subject here. This concept of Palgin the Buddha. We break, even though you put it together in one sentence, we can divide it in half and say the part we believe, another part we can't. So regarding himself, he's kind of like a woman. But the Chosim he can't. We didn't have a Kim status like any other contract. Even though you put it together in one word, we're going to break it up. Rabbi Abaye then said, not because of Rabbi's question, because he doesn't believe in Palgin the Buddha, but he himself reconsidered and he said, no, in fact, it's the converse. He's not kind himself, nor is he kind of in fact, he's not kind the assets because he didn't make him, and therefore he becomes like secondary compared to the assets, and therefore he's not kind of survivor. Later of says Abaye, I understand. I agree with you. He's not kind the assets. Like any other stand. Why shouldn't you break up his words? Says, I disagree. Whether he said in two separate statements, or whether he put it together, it's kind himself, but not his assets. Why do you believe what you're saying? Is because you believe in the concept, the principle of Reb Shimon and Palgin the Buddha. We break up a word. That's what you're saying, and I have a problem with that. First of all, which Reb Shimon are we talking about? Now we learn. If a guy writes to his Eved, all my assets belong to you, is Yotza ben Chayim. Then the din is that he goes free. Right? He goes free. What happens? Shaya Karka Kosher. He said, I'm retaining one property, but he didn't highlight which one. I'm retaining one property. So he clearly said he's retaining one property, but he didn't spell out which one it is. So when he said Kol Nechas, he meant everything but that one property. Maybe he's holding back the Eved. How do you know? Maybe he's holding back the Eved. He said all my property belongs to you. He's playing around with it. He wanted the Eved to mind it as if it's his own. So he told him that story. Lo Yotze B'Chayil go free. Rab Shimon says no. Rab Shimon says the fact is, he says Kol Nechasai means the Eved as well goes free, and one property maybe is held back but he didn't reveal which one, so the Eved is free. Achim, unless he says Kol Nechasai Nesunin L'Ploini, all the Nechasim go to this person, Chutz me'echad meribe sheben, except for one Nechas, and he specifies an amount. It doesn't matter what the value of the Eved is, but now that he specified something. We don't know what that something is. He didn't just say, I'm holding something back. Those words, Karka Koshu. He just says, 1 out of 10,000 I'm holding back. The evidence worth maybe half of his property, but you don't know, it's an expression. So maybe he's holding back the evidence. Maybe in my eyes, that's all you're worth. Even though on the market, you might be worth money-wise, monetary-wise, a lot more. But to me, you're worth 10,000. Yeah. Now, Shimon says, by saying hu ben chayrin, right? It makes no difference if there were other assets there were no assets. It makes no difference. For example, he says, clearly, I'm giving this is how Rashi learns. It's no different. I am giving you. He says, kol nechasai, all the properties except property that I have in another city. Right, so then he's kind of himself, and then clearly he's kind of not only himself, but also kind of the rest of the properties except that asset. And makes no difference if he says I'm holding back a property. We don't know which property. So in that case, he gets no properties back. But either way, the ever goes free. Must be because we divide the words. We dissect the words. He's not a property. He said kol nechasai, but we're dividing it. The ever is separate. And the rest of the properties are different. We're tasting disagree with Rashi. He says that if he says Kol Nechasai, he had 10 properties, he didn't specify which one. He said Chut Mekarka, whatever. He didn't say which one. Then that's not the din that all 10 remain with the Balabas. He has the right to take the best property he wants, the most premium property there, because he didn't Yad Balashtal Tachtayna. So the owner takes the best property, and that's it. And the rest of the properties go to the Eved as well. Not like Rashi says that the Eved gets none of the properties. Anyway, bottom line is that's Reb Shimon holds you divide the words. It's a question as follows. And even Rab Nachman said that even Rabbi Yossi praised Rab Shimon. In fact, he said, the halach is like Rameir. No, but the halach is you don't say Palgin in the Buddha. So what are you arguing with the Bible for? The Tanya Bilun, Kishanem Dvorim from Rabbi Yossi heard this discussion. He used the pasuk which the Shlomo Melech said. He said in the pasuk, "Svasayim Yishaku." I will kiss the lips. This is how Rashi learned shot. Somebody says the right things. I'm so happy. Taisha says, no, but you can kiss somebody's lips. Taisha says that everybody else in the room are going to seal their lips. They won't say a word because when they hear the truth, everyone recognizes the truth. Very interesting. But this is Rashi and Taisha's there. I guess Taisha lived a few generations later, the world became a bit more modern. So it was no longer acceptable. Says the Gemara, so that's saying, my question is, Allah is not like Reb Shimon. No Palgin in the Buddha. Second one, me, Reb Nachman Hachi, when I was back with me. Reb Nachman said that. Rabbi Yossi said, Reb Nachman Shchiv Merah, a person who's on the deathbed. Now we know the Shchiv Merah, when he gives away all his assets, if he becomes better, everything, his entire star falls apart, unravels, because it's like a Tanai. I'm only doing it because I thought I'll die, but if I'm going to live, I never intended to give it away. So Shchiv Merah Shekasav Kol Nechasa Lavda. If he wrote this entire estate goes to the Eved, then he got better. Chayzeb ben Nechasim, he can have charata on all of his assets, take them all back. But the Einu Chayz Eved, once the Eved was set free, set free. So we do say Palgin in the Bura, we divide his words, even though he said Kol Nechasa Lavda. Chayzeb ben Nechasim. How can you have charata? Why is it Chasim Machkimerahu? Why not? Once he was set free already, he has the chalos of a yid. You can then revert back to an Eved Kanani because there's a halachic religious status as well. Clearly, Palgin in the Buddha. Ella Amar Rabashi comes along Rabashi and says, Hasam Haina time over there. But Rab Nachman said the halacha is like Rab Meir, not because he doesn't believe in Palgin in the Buddha. Everyone agrees the principle of Palgin in the Buddha. That's what Rabbi Paskin. You know why he's arguing with Rab Shimon? Because the law of Kruz Gitu, it's not a clear, in order to be a get just by a woman, it has to be very clear that that all ties have been severed. In fact, we'll learn later if you have even one tanai left over, any conditions that don't, any strings attached, that's no good. Permanent strings attached. Exactly. Completely cut off. Yeah, same thing over here, yeah. Over here, because it's not clear in his words, he says, Kol Nechasai. And it's not clear in his words that the Eved, he said they're Eved free because he talked about all the Chasim. And then we see that the Chasim remain behind because he held something back. So it's like the strings attached. It's not clear cut. And that is why the Eved doesn't go free. That's the argument. Nothing to do with the concept of Palgin and Debura. And let's quickly go to the Mishnah. If there are anybody who's complaining, you have to bring Eidim in Israel. But you didn't say if anybody complains, you have to bring Eidim to verify the signature. Who's complaining? Kama. One person comes along and says, hey, it's a fraudulent get. If one person comes along, it's too late. We have a get. One person cannot in any way, cast aspersions on the get. They'll eat it today. Two people. No. If it's two people, what does it help if you're going to verify signatures? Two against two. Two say that it's a valid get. Two say it isn't a valid get. Today, but today, my chazid is samkahani. Why is the deem fit to rely on these people? It's my kahani. Either the Baal, the husband comes along and is ma'arim. We had a machlekes Rishonim whether the husband can taka disqualify or he'll just be moitzi laz. One last thing, Rabbi Yaakov Endon has a very interesting thing going back to this star you write on Shabbos. He actually argues, which is everybody, because everyone said this is the Raisa, and we allow the guy to do an Isa the Raisa because the mitzvah is so great, and then we had the whole discussion if it's limited to that or not limited to that. And why is it so great? Because the God of Hashem comes along in the background and says, he says, it's the reason why you're allowed here because nothing really happened. Remember, every buyer has to have a seller, and when Rashi learns the seller is a goy, which this is when was this allowed? Only the seller is a goy. So if the seller is a goy, really the sefer is working for the seller, the vendor. Maybe also for the Eid, but he's working really for himself because he's getting paid. And the seller, so such a small avera here. That's why you can have a guy doing it. Not because it's such a big mitzvah, but it's such a small avera, which is a very different perspective than everybody else. Okay.